keep going. There we go. Welcome, everyone. I hope you're all feeling well. I hope you're feeling invigorated, or at least semi-well on our roller coaster of emotion that is this week and this year. We are very excited to have you here joining us at the UCLA Tribal Legal Development Clinic Brown Bag Lunch Series. Originally conceived as a fun afternoon treat for our law students in the Tribal Legal Development Clinic to discuss exciting lawyering issues in Indian country, quickly expanded because it turns out lawyering in Indian country is fascinating. And so we have opened it up to the public, for which we are very excited to have you joining us. Because there are so many of us, we will be muted, but we invite you to ask questions in the questions box. With that, I'd like to briefly introduce my colleague, Professor Angela Riley, professor at UCLA School of Law, to say hello.
Hi, everybody. It's really nice to see you all. I'm glad you're here, and I'm just really grateful to Lauren for putting this together and to Ethel Branch for being our guest speaker. So welcome.
Thank you. And yes, with that, I am very excited to introduce Ethel Branch, an attorney with Kanji Katzen, but of course she wears many hats, including a mother of a brand new baby. Congratulations, Ethel. But we are very excited to have you here to, well, first of all, we want to hear all of the fascinating things that you think that we should hear, but we are especially interested in the Navajo Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund. And so welcome, and we'd like to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's always exciting to get to work with Angela and the team at UCLA, so thank you. So yeah, I'll just dive right in, give you a little bit of the history. So the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund is an initiative of Ye Ha'oth Nadot, which means may the Navajo people have fortitude, which is, of course, very appropriate to this particular context, but also gives a clue as to what the organization wants to work on. Generally speaking, it's kind of grown out of the need to protect our community from vulnerabilities that we've experienced in the COVID context, but that we could experience in future pandemic environments or other emergency situations, such as events precipitated by climate change. So it's focused really on resiliency and self-sufficiency. And so this all was really, not really something that we had planned. It just kind of came into being as a result of the entry of COVID-19 into our environment. It just kind of started randomly. I was doing some grocery shopping for my family, my own family, as well as my mom, who raises my nieces. And I had been watching COVID-19 for a while and was really concerned about it. Had heard about, what was happening across the ocean and cities being shut down. Some cities handling it very well. Or some countries like Taiwan. And then, of course, I previously was practicing in Seattle. And so that was the first domestic environment where COVID-19 emerged. And so I was watching that really closely and was just, being really cautious personally, making travel decisions in February to protect my family from exposure to COVID-19. And so in March, COVID came to Arizona, and people were starting to, buy out all the toilet paper and doing, hoarder type shopping. And so it finally reached the point where I felt like, okay, I need to do shopping for my family as well. and just make sure that, if there's a period that we need to isolate for 2 weeks, we're capable of doing that. And my mom lives on the Navajo Nation, and doesn't have electricity or running water like so many of our relatives there. About a third of the nation doesn't have those modern day conveniences. And so, was doing some shopping for her as well, and encountered barren shelves for, things like toilet paper, obviously, but also Spam and non-perishable things that folks like my mom would need, the elders who don't have refrigeration would need. So I became really concerned about this. And it kind of kept me up that night. And I mentioned all of this to my partner, and we talked about, well, maybe we could sponsor some families on Navajo and Hopi. My partner is Hopi. And so we were thinking that that was what we would do. And then I thought, well, maybe there would be other people who would be willing to help as well. And we could maybe, sponsor more families to give them this opportunity to protect their families and make sure that, those folks in really remote areas who are driving long distances would be able to actually have something when they come to town to do their shopping. And so from that, I did an exploratory post on Facebook in the morning and got really great positive responses from friends all over the country saying that they would be willing to contribute to this effort. So I went ahead and formed a GoFundMe. That was March 15th. I formed that about 11 o'clock in the morning. And by 11 o'clock that evening, we had raised $5,000. So I thought, okay, this is more than I was anticipating. I was thinking it would be more like $1,000 if I was lucky. And so I immediately reached out to a bunch of really incredible women leaders I know on Navajo and Hopi, because I knew like I wouldn't be able to just spread that as far and wide as it should be spread to people who needed it most, just by myself. And so I knew that these women care a lot about their communities and would know, where the need was at and how to connect resources with that need. And from that grew our leadership team. We now have 12 women who are part of this team. We also have an honorary male member, Cleve Benali, who has this incredible team of volunteers through Kinthena Mutual Aid here in Flagstaff. And they're helping with many different things right now. They're avidly labeling 4-ounce bottles and filling them with hand sanitizer that we can hand out in our care packages. So that's kind of the origin for how this started. And obviously the GoFundMe gained a lot of traction. And so this effort continued to build. By the 16th, the second day, one of my team members was like, okay, I'm going to go shopping. Let's go shopping. Let's get this food out to people. We were observing what was happening and had concerns about the supply chain. So wanted to make sure we were getting supplies secured so we could distribute those. And so we started shopping that Monday. And I tried reaching out to corporate departments of grocery stores, but things were a little bit in chaos for the grocery stores at that time. They were trying to handle the excess demand. And so a lot of the high-level staff weren't available. And so, I just went out myself as well and started shopping. And so it took a while actually to get access to the GoFundMe dollars. So we were purchasing out of pocket initially in anticipation of gaining access to those funds. And then as, the momentum continued to build very early on, we realized we need to, I felt uncomfortable, I don't want to put this money in a personal account. We need to have some kind of an infrastructure to be able to handle something this big. And so I reached out to some folks I had worked with previously, the Rural Utah Project, who do really great work on Navajo, mostly in the Utah areas of Navajo, but they've extended into Arizona, working on voting rights issues. And they were willing to be our corporate sponsor. So we've been working with them to ensure that, large donors get the 501c3 donation benefit. And they've sort of, been that institution to help us move forward in our work. And we've moved to doing bulk order purchases at this point. And just like, in terms of what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, the primary objective was protective, wanting to protect our nations from exposure or vulnerability to COVID-19, despite knowing that there were inherent vulnerabilities such as the limited access to running water. But the primary objective was to prevent the incursion of COVID-19 in our community, particularly with our most vulnerable community members. So that would be, those identified as high risk of adverse effects if they contract COVID-19 by the CDC. So that was, elders 65 and over, those with underlying conditions that included things like diabetes, lung disease, heart disease, folks who are on dialysis. So just inherently a significant sector of our populations. So we sought to provide these individuals, including vulnerable families. So we wanted to make sure, because of the expense in bulking up for 2 weeks worth of food items, all the items you need for 2 weeks to avoid going to the store or leaving your home. And so we felt like that would be a hardship on some families. And so we wanted to make sure that families with children also had access to these items. And so we included them in the scope as well. And so we provided food, water, cleaning supplies, Tylenol, things that people might need if they actually did contract COVID-19. Yeah, so now we've kind of expanded that given the current circumstances with so many people in our community that do have COVID-19. So we're also, providing food to COVID positive community members. We learned in some instances, hospitals were diagnosing individuals with COVID and then providing them with no resources, just kind of sending them home. And so of course, the first place people want to go when they're told that they need to isolate for 2 weeks is the grocery store. And so, that was kind of terrifying to us to know that people would be knowing that they had COVID and not really having a choice, if they wanted to have food for 2 weeks, having to go into the grocery stores and then exposing everyone in the grocery stores. So we wanted to prevent that community spread. And so we are providing resources to COVID positive community members as well, and folks who are presumed positive or awaiting test results. So, more proactively, now that there is a curve on Navajo, when we started this, we still hadn't, there hadn't been the first case of Navajo. That didn't happen until 2 days later. And so now we're in sort of a responsive mode of trying to flatten the curve. And we have some other things that we work on as well. There's obviously the need for public education. So we do some of that as well. And then we also were learning that there were a number of high contact individuals in our communities that didn't have adequate PPE. And unfortunately, that is still the case. Like our community health representatives who go into the homes of our elders, and they really know who the people in our communities are who need help because of their underlying conditions, but they didn't have adequate PPE. And then of course our first responders, many of them are without that, our police officers, medical staff. It's been really, really challenging for those high contact individuals, having that limit in the PPE supplies that are available. So we work to provide those individuals with PPE as well. We have a subsidiary organization Navajo Seamstresses United, COVID Doda. We have 2 chapters of that, one on Western and one on Eastern. They have like over 500 seamstresses. Most of them are Navajo, but we do have some volunteer seamstresses in from the Nakota, Dakota, and Lakota nations, as well as far away as Los Angeles, New York, and Georgia. And that group has just been incredible. Everyone's volunteering their time, and in many instances there are volunteer or donations of fabric, and that group has been able to produce or distribute over 27,000 items of PPE, most of that being face masks, but also surgical caps, surgical gowns, booties, things of that nature. In some instances, those items have been donated by businesses. And so the teams just kind of work as a clearinghouse, making sure that those items get to the high contact individuals who need them. A few weeks ago, Navajo Nation started requiring that everyone going out into public wear a face mask. So we are including face masks also in our care packages, along with the hand sanitizer. So that is how we are operating presently. Let's see. In terms of the service we've provided so far, as of June 3rd, we've been able to provide these care packages to over 7,500 households. So there are a number of relief efforts that are operating on Navajo Nation right now. Each kind of has its own way of doing their work. Our approach is that, we do want people to be home for a meaningful period of time, that 2-week period of time, in part because if they have been exposed to COVID, that is sort of the period to see if the cycle of symptoms develop. And it's also just kind of a meaningful period of time for a family to be safe. So we try to provide 2 weeks worth of food for the entire household, because, even though we have identified target populations, we have many multi-generational homes. So if one person has to leave the household to get food or diapers, baby formula, whatever, then they're going out and risking exposure to themselves, and whatever they pick up outside, they bring home to their family. And so, they risk exposing our target population as well. I
wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. A lot of the issues that you've identified are issues, that are impacting the whole country and the whole world, right? Like supply issues, exposure, and yet Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe, we know, have faced devastating rates of infection, as well are face unique issues just in general access to grocery stores. It's a huge geography. I wonder if you could just speak a little bit about some of the unique issues impacting these communities.
Sure. I think this gets to some environmental issues in terms of, why we're particularly vulnerable in our communities. The Navajo Nation has been a national sacrifice area for this country for almost a century. Our council was formed in 1922. The first matter of business was to sign off on an oil and gas lease. And the council was formed in order to facilitate those types of agreements for outside companies and governments to benefit off of the resources that we have in our territory. And so we've suffered a legacy of that with the impacts of the coal mines, as well as the coal-fired power plants. We're extremely heavily burdened, with the dirtiest coal-fired power plant in the country. The reason for the Clean Power Plan under the Obama administration, one of the largest holes the ozone is right over an area on Navajo where there are multiple coal-fired power plants. And so that's led to some health effects. We see that in the high incidence of asthma with respect to that. And then we also, of course, have a disproportionate number of uranium sites on the nation. We actually have over 100, or not 100, over 1,000 individual sites. Usually, people refer to the mining claims, which is 524, which is still a lot. But the actual number of sites are much larger than that. And that has led to high incidence of exposure to radiation, cancer. And so, in this context, our people have disproportionate adverse health conditions with the effects, particularly of radiation, breaking down the integrity of cells, and that having a connection to diabetes. So there's that issue, right, that makes us particularly susceptible to adverse consequences if our people contract COVID-19. But then there are also just those unique challenges of like what you're mentioning, the significant geography, a landmass for Navajo Nation that's roughly the size of West Virginia, and having only 13 grocery stores on the reservation, and not the highest quality food either. And so many people will do their grocery shopping off reservation to have access to the better quality food, the greater selection. And so, unfortunately, our reservations are extreme food deserts. And so that's very problematic for just stability and food security. So yeah, those are some unique circumstances, and those are some of the issues that the nonprofit that we formed under Utah law, the Yeha Nadot, wants to work on, outside of this COVID relief initiative, because there's the overcrowding in housing as well. When I was working on voting rights issues on Navajo Nation, we learned that like 1/3 of the nation would be homeless if they weren't couch surfing, which is just staggering to think about. And so that, those folks who are essentially homeless and couch surfing are part of what's leading to these multi-generational homes, overcrowding, which in the COVID context can be devastating and make it very difficult for people to isolate if there's one person in the household that's ill. And so, we are seeing lots of situations where an entire household is infected with COVID-19. And people are, when they're losing family members, like I just spoke with someone today where they lost like 6 family members, which is absolutely devastating for some families. So yeah, these are some of the unique challenges that need solutions. Honestly, given that this is a law school forum, one thing I often talk about, in addition to the environmental justice issues and that connection to public health issues, is the fact that we've been in this self-determination era for a very long time, and not enough positive effect has been experienced in Indian country, particularly for larger reservations. That's great that there's greater respect for tribal self-governance and self-determination, although query whether there's really much respect. For example, when the nation takes over its leasing authority, it's only allowed to do so by the federal government because the nation adopts the federal regs, right, and administers that program the same way the federal government would. And so that's problematic. Like the level of recognition and respect for tribal self-governance is not as complete as it should be to have enough positive benefit in Indian country. But then there's also the issue of, the dispossession of resources in Indian country, and the paternal oversight and, locking us into these contracts that are way below market value for our natural resources. And so, just in terms of capital in Indian country, it's just really not there. And in order for us to have economic development, be successful in that, particularly where we have large populations or large land masses, there's a need for an infusion of resources from our trustees to ensure that we have, the same ratio of paved roads as off-reservation. We have access to broadband in our communities, just the same as they do off-reservation. And we have, the same level of access to running water and electricity as off-reservation. And you're seeing like all of these inequities that I'm talking about in the COVID context are, compounding these, compounding the impact that something like COVID-19 has in our communities in terms of, the high contraction level as well as, the death rate. So that's something, I hope all of us can do some advocacy on that because, not enough has been done. There needs to be more respect for tribal self-governance and self-determination, allowing us to, actually draw on our natural laws and our fundamental laws to replace the federal regulations and laws that have restricted our ability to utilize our resources. And then, of course, having that parity with outside communities in terms of access to critical capital infrastructure. So important. We're not starting from an even starting block. And until we do, we're going to continue to struggle in terms of bringing in economic development. So hopefully, this will be a wake-up call to Congress to say, hey, we need to make sure that that there's parity in Indian country and that, people have running water to wash their hands with, or, the same level of paved roads and access to broadband so that our kids, like kids in Indian country, don't miss out on completing their education when something like this disrupts the school system. Like my nieces, were trying to complete their semester of school and they just couldn't because they didn't have access to internet. And so that's just incredibly challenging. And I'm sure that's been an issue in many other places in Indian country.
Well, you very much previewed Professor Carpenter's question, so I think I might reverse the order of the questions. Apologies, Professor Riley, but Professor Carpenter asks about the social movement aspect of all of this. You're so inspiring and the work that you do makes a difference, yet sometimes as lawyers, we feel removed from this kind of work. Given all of the lawsuits on the call, how do you think about the relationship between our role as lawyers and activists, our relationship with communities in times of crisis or otherwise? It's a broad question, but any additional response that you have, we appreciate.
Yeah, I think many of us who are Native American who become lawyers choose that profession because of an activist sort of ethos, right? Like wanting to make a difference in our communities and to change the inequities that exist and to ensure justice for our people, right? And so I guess it's natural that I, like someone like me would say, okay, I'm gonna, I want to continue doing activist work, even though this isn't really legal work. And so I'm just fortunate that I have the support of my firm in terms of being able to try to do both. It's but it is very different work. And, you know, both are rewarding in very different ways. You know, becoming a lawyer is really interesting, because, you know, I pursued my joint degree in law and policy. And people will always ask, you know, like, do you regret having done a joint program? And I don't, but I think regardless of how I would have pursued my path, I don't think I would have had a regret. But I do feel like, you know, becoming a lawyer really puts you on a track. You know, when you're in law school, you're mostly doing legal internships. And when you graduate, it's expected that you work in the legal profession. And I certainly felt that pressure. You know, I felt that I wouldn't be able to legitimately call myself a lawyer if I didn't practice law for 10 years. So I focused on that. You know, one of my hopes and dreams, which seemed unattainable at the time, just because of so many factors involved in being selected for a position like that. And, you know, one of my hopes was to be able to serve my nation as Attorney General, and I was blessed to have that opportunity. So, you know, so I feel like I've had that experience of being a lawyer. And when this unprecedented situation arose, you know, it's like, I feel like I have to do something. And of course, as I mentioned, you know, it was like, it started out really small. You know, like I just wanted to make sure that really that, you know, my mom had the things that she needed. And then that opened my eyes to, you know, I mean, I care about my community. So I was like, she's not the only one who's being impacted this way. And then made me want to do something to help people in the larger community. I mean, it's not easy to bridge the two. I'm only able to do this because I have the support of my firm. In a normal context, I mean, I think you would have to choose between which path you were pursuing, even though, again, like, you know, being a lawyer in Indian country is inherently activist in nature. Although, you know, as you become trained in the law and you practice that, you'll learn that your level of activism is greatly restricted in many different ways. So you can try to push for change as a lawyer in Indian country, but a lot of times it's really just on the margins. So anyway, but you know, this type of work is very, very different in terms of what we're doing. Again, it's not legal work. It's, you know, just, I mean, I just kind of view it as common sense work, right? You know, it's like, we know what our community is. We know what their needs are. And we know the resources that we need to get from point A to B. So let's figure out how to do that. Let's do it as quickly as we can. And I felt really blessed to I do feel blessed to be able to do this work because, you know, I had experienced the Gold King mine spill where I was in that legal role as Attorney General for Navajo Nation. And that was also an unprecedented emergency. And I wasn't really able to help people directly. You know, in that role, you represent the government, and yes, you're looking out for the good of the people, but really your role is to be an attorney and do the legal work and not be out there, you know, doing the direct relief and assistance. And so, you know, I wasn't able to help the people in that context the way I would have been able to if I were just, you know, an activist. And so, you know, in this context, again, it's actually quite liberating to step into this context and just do so as an activist, trying to help the people gain access to the resources that they need in order to be able to shelter in place and avoid exposure to their families. and to overall, help try to minimize the effect of COVID-19 in our communities. And it's hard, you look at the numbers, you look at the curve, and sometimes it's sort of like overwhelming, is there anything we can do really? Is what we're doing having an effect? But we know in the stories from the people that we talked to, that we provided resources to, we know that it's making a difference. And these numbers could be much worse if this work were not happening. And there are lives that are being saved. There have been a number of instances where families are in isolation and they need food, or they run out of food, and we have to bring food in for them. It's that situation that I mentioned before where there's a diagnosis and people are asked to quarantine and they don't have the resources. They weren't expecting to get that kind of diagnosis. And so in order to protect the larger community, we're able to bring in the resources right away. So Kristen, I don't know if that really answered your question or addressed it in the way you were hoping to take that question. If you have additional questions on that, I'm happy to take a go at trying to answer them.
No, I just want to thank you for such a reflective answer. I mean, I think so many of us are just struggling about what to do right now in the settings. And I think you're somebody who has charted a path that is making a difference. So it's just really helpful to learn from you and then I guess reflect on our own opportunities. So thank you.
Thank you.
Well, perhaps we can dive back into the minutia of your day-to-day work. The fund has in fact exceeded your $1,000 goal and has likely helped propel international awareness about the issues that Navajo Nation and the Hopi tribe are facing. Professor Riley asks how you are dealing with messaging regarding staying safe and managing risk, especially now that so many states are in the process of reopening, even though nothing has actually changed. The curve is not flattening in many places.
Yeah. Well, for our volunteers, I mean, we basically have not changed anything about the way we're doing business. We very early on established very strict health and safety protocols, both just general health and safety protocols that included kind of a 101 on what COVID-19 is and, symptoms, things like that, things that our volunteers would need to know about the disease to protect themselves and their families. And then we also have more detailed protocols relating to how we handle our distribution. And of course, like all of this includes the things like the social distancing, wear masks and PPE, be washing your hands, regularly and for 20 seconds at least. So we're continuing to stick to those and being as conservative as possible. Like when we see guidance, there have been discussion about leaving items to sit for a little while and treating that as sterilized. And it's just too dangerous to take risks like that. So we're more conservative. We just stick with sterilizing everything, wiping everything down, because the worst thing that we could do is, be part of the problem. So we're sticking with that, and we don't expect to change the services that we're providing. With what's happening around the Navajo Nation with states reopening, I mean, we've seen a spike in Arizona, right? So we just anticipate that things are not going to be very different in 2 weeks from what they were 2 weeks ago. So, it's still a crisis situation on Navajo, and, Hopi numbers continue to rise. Not as bad as Navajo, but that's, they are located right in the center of Navajo. So there's such a strong need to make sure that that community is protected and it doesn't experience the same level of contamination that Navajo Nation has. But yeah, in terms of messaging, you know, we're sticking with the same messaging. We actually have some additional media materials that are going to be provided in our care packages that just underscore the messaging. You know, it's been really challenging. The word that was chosen for COVID-19 in our community essentially translated into big cold. And that was problematic because some of our elders or folks in our community would hear that and think, oh, okay, so it's like a big cold. You know, I get the flu every year and I've survived that. So, you know, if this is a big cold, it can't be worse than the flu, right? And so that was really problematic in terms of people not really realizing the distinction between COVID-19 and the flu and the cold. So we did invest in some radio time to have a nurse who is very fluent in Navajo and is used to explaining these highly technical medical terms, do some public education on air, and take the time. You know, it was like 11-minute pieces. It's not something that could be covered in a short little PSA clip. It really needed a lengthy explanation so that people could really appreciate the distinction between COVID-19 and the flu and the regular cold. So, you know, we continue to try to develop messaging, like try to make it a little more fun. But that's, you know, our primary focus has been on just getting the food up north, up to the reservation and out the door to as many people as possible. So we haven't spent a lot of time on the messaging, like really fleshing that out and building the presence the way we'd like to. You know, like we've talked about things like billboards. We have discussions about developing coloring books that can be included in the care packages, with the thinking that, you know, if we would do a really good job of educating the kids, they can educate their families. Just, you know, on top of the additional education that's happening in the larger community. So hopefully that was responsive.
Yeah, we got another messaging question, and it's a doozy. So this is a great question, but I imagine this will take us through the end. Thank you, Mia, for your question. Mia's curious about the media coverage of Indian country during this crisis. Despite the mainstream coverage of the dire situation on Navajo Nation, the long-standing invisibility and erasure of Indian country is ongoing. How do we leverage the immediate media attention to get more non-Native people to understand the deep structural issues at play in Indian country, some of which you've mentioned, including the lack of respect for tribal sovereignty, structural racism, not honoring trust responsibilities, chronic underfunding of programs by the federal government, ongoing impacts of colonialism, et cetera, et cetera. Too many media stories focus on intimate pain of marginalization and not on the structural forces that cause it.
And I think that's why, you know, every time we get interviewed, we try to talk about those issues, you know, and try to explain, like, this is why it's impacting our community so greatly. And, you know, it's not so much a poverty issue as it is this larger issue of environmental justice, as well as, yeah, I mean, failed trust responsibility, right? And that, the failure of our trustees to really relinquish the control that they have in Indian country that prevents Indian nations from capitalizing on the resources that they have within their boundaries. You know, so I think, you know, when you do get that, that's how we do it. We just have to keep telling that story and trying to amplify that, you know, the story is bigger than what the media is portraying it as. And unfortunately, I mean, in this era of journalism, you know, everything is distilled to such a small soundbite, and so that's kind of like what draws the attention of the media and the public in terms of, you know, the poverty story. But I think, you know, we have to just keep pushing and telling the why of, you know, where things are, why things are the way they are now. And that's where being a law student or a lawyer can be very, very helpful in terms of you having a better context for that story, and the ability to explain how laws and policies have impeded you know, healthy development in Indian country and access to resources. So yeah, I mean, it's tough, but but the cool thing is, you know, there are so many of us, and it's not just about having that conversation on CNN, right? It's also about having that conversation at the local level, whether that's with you know, local school boards and making sure that those school boards are incorporating curriculum. It's very similar to the Indigenous Peoples Day initiative. You know, unfortunately, I mean, it started out really great with, you know, trying to tie in that public education piece and change people's paradigms, right? So that they understand better that what Indian people are, what Indian nations are, that we're still here, that we're continuing, that we're thriving and continuing to become healthier and healthier and stronger, and we're not going to go away, right? And so, but you know, that's kind of, now it's just sort of like, let's recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, and there's not as much of a push for the policies that should go along with that. But you know, in this context as well, you know, it's all about, you know, trying to utilize this as an opportunity for education, whether that's at, you know, at the national level or the state level or the local level. You know, for this to be, and I mean, it's sad that this is, that people's eyes have to be open to what's happening, and that there's shock about the reality of resource limitations in Indian country. I mean, everybody should already know that, number one. And number two, these inequities should not exist at all. And so, you know, we need to just keep telling that story. And I know it can be frustrating. I have friends who get tired of feeling like they have to educate people all the time. But you know, I guess that's just a burden that we have to bear, because otherwise other people, it doesn't, nobody else is going to do it if we don't do it ourselves, right? And especially as lawyers, I mean, that's something that you can do really well. Yeah, I wish there were, you know, like a better, a silver bullet answer, but you know, giving voice to the situation and the diversity of what circumstances exist in Indian country, but also, you know, those parallels, like with the environmental justice issue. You know, I actually did this exercise in graduate school where we did an overlay of the Superfund sites in this country and Indian country, and it was shocking how many times the Superfund sites were located on Indian lands or immediately proximate to Indian lands. And people need to know about that and understand that that's why our communities in significant part continue to struggle with so many social issues. So anyway, I don't know if that leaves some time for
It does leave us some time. With our last few minutes, I wonder if you have any closing thoughts and what we can do to be most effective and helpful for Indian country.
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing that I often share with youth, Navajo youth that I'm talking to, is this concept of their ability to have an impact, right? And we all seem like we're in the sea of individuals. We're this small speck in the sea, but we really can individually make a difference. You know, like there are so many people. I mean, there are many GoFundMe and relief efforts that are happening on Navajo Nation, and you know, people are getting help through this. You know, some of them are large, some of them are small, but it is making a difference in people's day-to-day lives. And so, you know, I would just, you know, remind all of you that, and of course you define for yourself, like how much you want to delve into the issue, but there's always something you can do. And, you know, sometimes that's something you do by yourself. Sometimes you pull in other people. And this is a great example of that. You know, like I had no idea what this was going to lead to. And it started out, you know, really small, and I pulled in some really great people, and it's become something huge, and it's having large scale effects in our communities. And yeah, I mean, you know, again, you define for yourself what that's going to be in terms of making a difference in the way that you choose to make that difference. But the opportunity is there. It's always there. And you know, like we have so many volunteers, and they're doing so many different things. That's a great example of, you know, someone in LA, right, could be part of our phone bank, calling people to make sure they got food, or people's help requests, and you know, there's something that everyone everywhere can be doing to help in some small way, right, or in a big way, like, you know, starting your own initiative. At some point, our team does want to, I mean, it's kind of late now, but we do want to do a Facebook Live tutorial essentially on, you know, how we structured ourselves and how we kind of grew this into what it is now. And you know, but there are other reservations that are in dire need of resources and need help. So, you know, I'm sure that you know, there's an opportunity for others to step up and do something similar to what we did here, or to help in some small way remotely. So I would encourage you all to continue thinking about that, and again, you know, continue the public education because nobody else is doing it, and try to shift that burden from yourself to larger institutions like public school systems, state governments. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. This was incredibly fascinating. We remain in awe of all of your work and your leadership. And certainly on behalf of the clinic, on behalf of UCLA, we'd like to thank you and wish you well in your next round of hard work leading these efforts. I wonder if Professors Carpenter or Riley have any closing thoughts?
Just wanted to say thank you so much, Ethel. We really appreciate everything you're doing and for taking the time out of so many obligations to talk to us and to our students. I know they're really, really grateful to hear from you, and as am I, as always. So it's great to see your lovely face, and I'm glad you and your family are doing well.
Thank you.
Likewise, same. You're a star. Thanks for being on, and hopefully we'll see you later.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone. We wish you a safe and healthy weekend. And thank you again, Ethel.
Thank you.
Take care.